There's something we accept without question about the development of modern cities. We assume infrastructure follows people. Population grows, demand increases, systems are built to meet that demand. It's the most logical sequence imaginable. It's how we explain nearly every major engineering project in recorded history. But when you look at the sewage and drainage systems built across Europe and North America between roughly 1840 and 1910, something doesn't line up. Not slightly. Not in one city. The gap between the scale of what was constructed and the populations officially recorded at the time of construction is, in several cases, extraordinary, and it appears consistently across dozens of unrelated cities, built by different governments, funded by different systems, separated by thousands of miles. That pattern is what this video examines. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Let's begin with what the official record tells us. By the mid-19th century, European and American cities were facing genuine public health crises. Cholera outbreaks, contaminated water supplies, raw sewage running through open streets. The need for underground drainage infrastructure was real, urgent, and well documented. City governments, under pressure from public health reformers, began commissioning large-scale sewer systems. London began its famous Metropolitan Board of Works project in 1858. Paris expanded its EGOUTS network significantly in the same decade. Hamburg, Vienna, Chicago, Boston. One by one, major cities undertook what historians describe as some of the greatest engineering achievements of the 19th century. This is the accepted explanation, and it makes sense. Until you look at the numbers. London's sewer system, designed by Joseph Bazalgette and substantially completed by 1875, included over 1,300 miles of street sewers and 82 miles of main intercepting sewers. The brickwork alone involved over 318 million bricks. The tunnels were engineered to handle not just the population of London at the time, approximately 2 million people, but, as Bazalgette himself reportedly stated, double that capacity. He anticipated correctly that London would grow. That part is often cited as visionary planning. But the construction timeline is less often examined. The main system was substantially completed within roughly 15 years, using mid-Victorian technology, horse-drawn transport, manual excavation, no electric lighting underground, no mechanized boring equipment of the kind we rely on today. The sheer volume of material moved, placed, and sealed within that window has led some engineering historians to note that the pace sits near the upper theoretical limit of what the documented labor force and available equipment could have achieved. The math isn't impossible, but it is uncomfortable. Now move from London to Paris. The Parisian sewer system, the Réseau d'Égouts, underwent dramatic expansion under Haussmann's renovation of the city, beginning in the 1850s. By 1878, Paris had over 360 miles of sewers. By 1910, that figure had grown to over 900 miles. Paris's population in 1851 was approximately 1 million within the city proper. By 1900, it had grown to roughly 2.7 million. Those numbers represent real growth, real demand. The infrastructure justification is clear on the surface. But the design capacity of the Parisian system was significantly beyond even that expanded population. The main collector tunnels, some of which are large enough to walk through upright, some wide enough to accommodate small boats, which famously carried tourists through them in the late 19th century, were not engineered for 2.7 million people living in modest density across a mid-sized European capital. They were engineered for something considerably larger. Some researchers note that the volumetric flow calculations built into the original Haussmann-era infrastructure would have been appropriate for a city of 5 to 8 million people with modern water use habits. Not a mid-19th century European capital with low per capita water consumption and limited indoor plumbing penetration among the working class. This is the discomfort the records invite. It's not that the systems are large. Large infrastructure is explainable. It's that the ratio between the documented population at the time of design, the documented technology available, the documented labor force employed, and the resulting scale of the finished systems doesn't compress neatly into the standard explanation. Visionary planning accounts for some of the excess capacity. Public health necessity accounts for the urgency. Neither, on their own, fully resolves the arithmetic. Hamburg presents a different kind of anomaly. After a devastating cholera epidemic in 1892, one of the last major cholera outbreaks in Western Europe, the city undertook rapid sewer modernization. The speed of redesign and implementation that followed has been studied as a model of civic response. But less discussed is the pre-existing infrastructure that engineers worked around and integrated into the new system. Hamburg already had drainage tunnels of substantial scale predating the 1892 crisis. Their precise origins, construction dates, and the populations they were supposedly built for are less cleanly documented than the post-1892 expansions. The records exist. They simply raise more questions than they settle. What separates an engineering anomaly from a genuine historical question is repetition. One city with oversized sewers is an outlier. A planning committee that miscalculated. A visionary engineer who overbuilt. Two cities invite a footnote. But when the same pattern, infrastructure scaled beyond documented population, constructed within compressed timelines, integrated with pre-existing systems whose provenance is not always clear, appears in London, Paris, Hamburg, Vienna, and across the Atlantic in cities we'll examine shortly, the question changes character. It stops being a question about individual cities. It becomes a question about the pattern itself. The standard historical framework answers this clearly. Industrialization drove unprecedented urban growth, public health crises created political will, and the Victorian era produced engineering ambition at a scale we now take for granted. That framework is coherent. It explains most of what we see. But there is a version of these records where the systems came first, where the infrastructure existed at scale before the populations that would have required it arrived. Not everywhere. Not in every case. But in enough cases, in enough cities, with enough consistency in the design surplus, that some researchers have begun to ask whether the direction of cause and effect is as settled as the textbooks suggest. And that question, once you see it in the numbers, is remarkably difficult to put down. It represented a developmental gap. Europe had centuries of accumulated civic infrastructure, dense urban cores, established trade networks. The United States, by contrast, was a young nation, vast in territory, thin in population density outside its northeastern corridor, and still largely rural in character as late as 1850. Which is precisely why what was built in American cities during that same window is so difficult to explain using the standard model. Chicago in 1850 had a population of approximately 30,000 people. It was a frontier trading post-made city, growing quickly, yes, but by no measure a major metropolitan center. The land it occupied was famously flat, poorly drained, and sat barely above the level of Lake Michigan. Open sewage ran through muddy streets. The public health situation was poor. In 1856, the city began one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in American history. Not a modest drainage improvement. A complete, citywide underground sewer network. And to make it function given the flat terrain, engineers raised the entire street grade of Chicago by several feet. Buildings were lifted. Foundations were reconstructed. The city, in effect, was physically elevated to allow gravity-fed sewage flow. The engineering achievement is extraordinary and well documented. What is less often examined is the scale to which the system was designed. By 1860, Chicago's sewer network was already engineered for a city far beyond its 109,000 residents of that census year. The tunnel diameters, the collector capacities, the junction infrastructure, all of it reflected planning assumptions that would only make demographic sense decades later, when Chicago's population crossed 1 million in the 1890s. The standard explanation: visionary planning. Forward-thinking engineers who anticipated growth. And perhaps that is exactly what it was. But Chicago was not an isolated case. Boston's sewer system, substantially expanded between 1876 and 1900, followed a similar pattern. The city's population in 1880 was approximately 363,000. The infrastructure built during that expansion period, particularly the main drainage tunnels running toward the harbor and the intercepting sewers of the metropolitan area, was designed with volumetric capacity that engineering historians have noted would be appropriate for a population 2 to 3 times larger. Again, visionary planning is a reasonable explanation. Again, it appears not just here but consistently. Brooklyn, before its consolidation into New York City in 1898, built sewer infrastructure in the 1880s that engineering surveys later described as overbuilt for contemporary demand. Philadelphia's combined sewer system, parts of which date to the 1880s and 1890s, contains main collector tunnels so large that portions have been repurposed in the modern era without structural modification, because they were already scaled for a city Philadelphia has not yet, even today, fully grown into. One city, a planning decision. 4 cities, a policy trend. Across 2 continents, in countries with different governments, different engineering traditions, different population pressures. Something that begins to look like a condition rather than a choice. Return now to the United Kingdom and look beyond London. Manchester's sewer network was substantially built between 1870 and 1895. Manchester in 1871 had a population of approximately 351,000. The system built to serve it, and the surrounding municipal borough, was, in the assessment of contemporary engineering reports, designed for significantly denser urban occupation than existed at the time of construction. Glasgow undertook major sewer works in the 1870s and 1880s under a series of city improvement acts. The scale of Glasgow's underground drainage infrastructure relative to its population has been noted by urban historians not as anomalous, but as exceptional, exceptional being, in academic writing, a word that carries the weight of something not fully explained. Leeds, Sheffield, Liverpool. Each city, in the same general window, 1860 to 1900, built underground systems whose design capacity sat comfortably above recorded population demands. The Public Health Act of 1875 is frequently cited as the legislative engine behind British sewer expansion. And it was. But legislation explains the decision to build. It doesn't explain why the systems were repeatedly built larger than the populations legally required to be served by them. There is a concept in infrastructure planning called design horizon, the future date for which a system is engineered. Modern water and sewage infrastructure is typically designed for a 50-year horizon. It is built today to serve the population projected to exist half a century from now. Applied to Victorian-era construction, this concept offers a clean resolution. Engineers projected population growth. They built ahead of it. The systems appear oversized today only because we're comparing them to contemporary populations rather than projected ones. This is a valid and well-reasoned explanation, but it generates a secondary question that is harder to resolve. Population projection in the 1860s and 1870s was not a precise science. Census data existed, but demographic modeling, the formal mathematical projection of future urban populations, was in its infancy. The assumptions Victorian engineers would have needed to make in order to justify, through bureaucratic funding processes, sewer systems scaled to populations 2 or 3 times current size would have required growth rates that were, in most cases, historically unprecedented at the time they were assumed. Some cities hit those projections. Chicago did. London did. Some cities never did. And in the cities that never reached the populations their sewers were built for, the infrastructure sits intact, functional, largely unmodified, still within capacity, as a kind of material argument that has no clean resolution in either direction. The pattern, examined across the UK and USA together, has a texture to it that individual city histories tend to flatten. It appears in coastal cities and inland cities. In cities that grew rapidly and cities that grew slowly. In cities built on flat land and cities built on hills. In cities funded by municipal bonds and cities funded by private enterprise. The consistency of the design surplus, infrastructure built ahead of demand at scale within compressed timelines, does not neatly map onto any single explanatory variable. It maps onto a period, roughly 1840 to 1910, across Western Europe and North America. A window in which underground urban infrastructure was installed, in city after city, at a scale and pace that the standard model of population-driven development doesn't fully account for. Some researchers, when examining this pattern in aggregate rather than city by city, have noted that it begins to resemble not a series of independent planning decisions, but something more like a template. A design standard applied across unrelated cities by unrelated engineers in unrelated countries, producing remarkably similar outcomes. Where that template came from, who established it, and what, or how much, it was designed to serve. Those are the questions that have drawn a growing number of researchers toward a label that is, itself, contested, a term that some use precisely and others use loosely, but which has become, for better or worse, the organizing word for this entire class of questions. It appears in historical atlases. It appears in encyclopedias published in the 17th and 18th centuries. It appears in the writings of European cartographers, diplomats, and explorers who used it, with varying degrees of precision, to describe a vast and loosely defined region stretching across Central Asia and into parts of Eastern Europe. In that narrow sense, Tartaria is not a fringe concept. It is a documented geographical designation with a traceable presence in the historical record. What it has become, in certain corners of historical research and online discourse, is something more complicated. Over the past 2 decades, a loose body of interpretation has emerged, not from academic institutions, not from peer-reviewed journals, but from independent researchers, architectural historians, and a growing number of people who began asking the same questions this video has been asking. Questions about scale. Questions about timing. Questions about infrastructure that appears to precede the populations assigned to build it. Within that body of interpretation, Tartaria has been repurposed. It is used not as a geographic label but as an explanatory one, a shorthand for the hypothesis that the world of the 18th and 19th centuries was more built up, more organized, and more globally connected than the standard historical model acknowledges. That what we call the Victorian construction boom was not, in this interpretation, an act of building, but an act of rebuilding, or inheriting, or repurposing systems that already existed at a scale the official population record cannot account for. It is important to say clearly what this interpretation is and is not. It is not a settled argument. It is not supported by direct documentary evidence of a unified pre-existing civilization. It does not have a consensus of mainstream scholars behind it. It is, at its core, an interpretive framework, one that some researchers find compelling precisely because it accounts for patterns that other frameworks struggle to resolve, and one that others reject precisely because it introduces assumptions for which physical evidence remains absent or ambiguous. One interpretation is not more emotionally satisfying than the other. Both carry the weight of what they cannot yet prove. Return, with that framing, to the sewage systems. The Tartaria-adjacent interpretation of Victorian drainage infrastructure runs roughly as follows. The systems found in London, Paris, Chicago, Hamburg, and dozens of other cities, systems too large for their documented populations, built too quickly for their documented labor forces, designed to standards that anticipated demand that in some cases never arrived, were not built from scratch by the populations credited with building them. They were, in this reading, discovered, integrated, extended, or adapted from infrastructure that predated the official construction record. The implication is not that Victorian engineers were fraudulent or that historical records were deliberately altered. The softer version of this interpretation, the one more careful researchers tend to advance, simply suggests that the starting point for 19th century urban infrastructure may have been further along than the official timeline implies. That engineers working in the 1860s and 1870s may have been working with, around, or from pre-existing systems whose origins were either not known to them or not recorded by them. Some researchers point to the uniform construction quality found in the oldest sections of various European sewer systems, brickwork and mortar that has, in engineering assessments, outperformed the expected lifespan of mid-Victorian construction by significant margins. Others point to junction architectures found in cities as geographically separate as Vienna and Boston that share design features not obviously traceable to any shared engineering manual or professional exchange. These observations do not constitute evidence of a prior civilization. They constitute questions without comfortable answers. The mainstream historical response to this class of interpretation is worth examining on its own terms, not to dismiss it, but to understand what it actually resolves and what it leaves open. Victorian engineers, the mainstream account argues, were genuinely exceptional. The period from 1840 to 1900 represented a unique convergence: political will, industrial capacity, public health urgency, and an engineering culture that prized ambition over caution. The systems appear oversized because the Victorians intended them to be oversized. They were building for empires, for industrial futures, for cities they believed would become the largest in human history. This is a coherent account. It is historically grounded. It explains the ambition, the speed, and, in the cases of cities like London and Chicago, the accuracy of the scale projections. What it explains less cleanly is the uniformity of the surplus across cities that did not reach Victorian projections. It explains less cleanly the presence in several cities of infrastructure sections whose construction dates are disputed or absent from the record. And it explains less cleanly why the design standards across dozens of unrelated civic projects in unrelated countries converged on a consistent volumetric excess rather than distributing randomly around population-driven need. Those gaps do not validate the Tartaria interpretation, but they do prevent the mainstream account from fully closing the question. There is a third position, less dramatic than either of the first two, that some architectural and infrastructure historians have begun to occupy quietly. It holds that the 19th century was a period of extraordinary historical disruption, not only in technology and politics but in institutional memory. Wars, epidemics, urban fires, forced migrations, and the rapid displacement of older civic administrations meant that the provenance of existing infrastructure was frequently unclear to the engineers who inherited it. When a city undertook a new sewer project in 1865, it often did so by surveying what already existed underground, and the surveys themselves were sometimes incomplete, sometimes lost, and sometimes simply not conducted with historical precision in mind. In this reading, the question of who built what, and when, and for how many people, may be genuinely unresolvable for certain sections of certain systems, not because of suppression or erasure, but because of the ordinary chaos of institutional discontinuity across 2 centuries of rapid change. That explanation is quieter. It carries less weight as a narrative, but it may be closer to the actual texture of historical record-keeping than either the triumphant Victorian story or the alternative framework that surrounds the word Tartaria. What this video has examined is a pattern, not a conclusion. The pattern is real, traceable in engineering records, population censuses, construction timelines, and infrastructure assessments spread across 2 continents and several decades. The pattern raises questions that the standard model of population-driven infrastructure development does not fully answer. Those questions have attracted multiple interpretations, ranging from the conservative to the speculative, and none of those interpretations currently has access to evidence sufficient to resolve them completely. The word Tartaria sits at the edge of that unresolved space. For some, it is a useful label for a genuine historical anomaly. For others, it is an unfounded extrapolation that imposes a false unity on patterns that are better explained by coincidence, ambition, and incomplete records. For most professional historians, it remains outside the scope of credible inquiry, not because the underlying questions are uninteresting, but because the interpretive leap from anomalous infrastructure to prior civilization crosses an evidentiary threshold that has not yet been cleared. What remains, after all of it, is the infrastructure itself. Underground. Intact. Still flowing. Built, officially, for populations that, in many cases, never fully arrived. Engineered to standards that, in several instances, have not required significant modification in over a century. Present beneath cities whose official histories begin, in most accounts, well after the brickwork was already laid. The records invite examination. What they do not yet offer is a place to stop looking.